March 26th stretches from crusader battlements to open European borders, touching art studios, revolutionary boulevards, and tense diplomatic tables before sunrise. Walk through sieges, symphonies, print shops, barricades, labs, independence proclamations, and peace signatures as we trace one date's long arc of consequence. Let's rewind. This is your This Day in History. On March 26, 1199, King Richard I paced the trenches outside Chaillot-Chabrol, personally scouting the stubborn Limousin stronghold that had defied his campaign for feudal dues. The crown's coffers were thin after crusade expense, and the Aquitanian revolt had made this honey-hoarding lord a symbol of defiance that Richard refused to ignore. Royal engineers hauled forward mangonels and sappers, yet the small fortress's angled walls and deep moat preserved its defenders through repeated bombardments. A defender named Peter Basile loosed a quarrel from the ramparts, the bolt tearing into Richard's shoulder, while the king reportedly applauded the archer's nerve. Camp surgeons tried to extract the barbed spike, but infection set in quickly, grim news murmuring through the Angevin lines as poultices failed. Richard's mortal wound unraveled the empire he had held together by force, elevating his brother John and reshaping the geopolitics of England and France. On March 26, 1636, the States of Utrecht ratified a charter transforming a Calvinist academy into the fully fledged Utrecht University. Dutch prosperity amid the 80 Years' War fueled civic pride, and the city sought a learned institution to match rival Leiden's prestige. The charter emphasized theology, law, medicine, and the mathematical arts, aligning scholarship with the Republic's mercantile and diplomatic ambitions. Gisbertus Vutius drilled ministerial rigor, while mathematician Bernardus Scotanus promoted practical surveying, a blend of doctrinal discipline and worldly application. Students filed in from across the Republic, trading notes on navigation, Calvinist orthodoxy, and the latest news from the front lines against Spain. 4 centuries later, the institution still wears the sunburst seal granted that day, its charter echoing in laboratories and lecture halls alike. On March 26, 1827, Ludwig van Beethoven exhaled his final breath in Vienna as a violent thunderstorm rattled the Stadtgasse windows. Months of jaundice, abdominal pain, and repeated operations had left the composer bedridden, yet still correcting proofs for his late string quartets. Conversation books recorded friends' silent messages, while Beethoven scrawled brusque replies, refusing to cede his artistic authority even as illness advanced. Witnesses swore a bolt of lightning cracked as he clenched his fist at the storm, a dramatic flourish that quickly became legend. News raced across Europe. By the funeral, an estimated 20,000 mourners pressed into the streets, signaling how completely his work had entered civic life. Composers from Schubert to Verdi would study the late quartets born in those final months, mining March 26th as a hinge between classical form and romantic daring. On March 26, 1830, the first edition of the Book of Mormon rolled off E.B. Grandin's press in Palmyra, New York. Grandin's apprentices set dense blocks of type from scribal copies, working through the night to meet Joseph Smith's ambitious schedule. Smith and his scribes combed galleys for transcription errors while debating how to finance the 3,000-copy run pledged to believers. Once bound, the volumes traveled by canal boat and peddler wagon across the burned-over district, inserting a new scripture into a crowded revival marketplace. Supporters framed the book as ancient testimony, while skeptics in Palmyra newspapers questioned its provenance, ensuring the text became a local flashpoint. The printing catalyzed a movement that would soon migrate westward, carrying the memory of that March press run into each new settlement. On March 26, 1871, Parisian voters elected the Commune's council after weeks of standoff between the National Guard and the government at Versailles. The uprising had begun when locals refused to relinquish cannon, and by election day, working-class districts hummed with clubs drafting radical platforms. 79 delegates, blending Jacobins, socialists, and anarchists, filed into the Hôtel de Ville, promising municipal democracy and social reforms. Decrees swiftly followed, remitting rent arrears, separating church and state, and planning worker-run cooperatives to stabilize the besieged capital. International observers weighed whether the Commune signaled a new socialist order or merely another French spasm, even as telegraphs dripped incomplete reports. Versailles commanders quietly positioned artillery for a counteroffensive, setting up the brutal spring showdown that would determine the Commune's fate. On March 26, 1917, British Empire forces advanced on Gaza at first light, opening the initial battle in the wider Sinai-Palestine campaign. Royal Flying Corps observers mapped Ottoman trenches, delivering hand-drawn mosaics that guided infantry and Australian mounted troops through the orchards. Cavalry detachments severed telegraph lines, but coordination faltered when sand clogged signal lamps and telephone cables. Ottoman commanders, bolstered by German staff officers, rotated reserves into the town, turning citrus groves into kill zones that stalled British bayonet charges. By afternoon, a Khamsin dust storm obscured the front, and conflicting casualty reports led headquarters to order a withdrawal just as victory loomed. The missed opportunity forced London to rethink command, paving the way for General Allenby's later offensives that would finally break the Gaza-Beersheba line. On March 26, 1953, Dr. Jonas Salk announced that his inactivated polio vaccine had triggered protective antibodies in preliminary trials. Years of painstaking work culturing poliovirus in monkey kidney tissue culminated in carefully dosed injections tested among Pittsburgh-area volunteers. Within hours, radio anchors interrupted programming with the hopeful bulletin, while wire services relayed Salk's cautious optimism nationwide. Parents of summer-scarred survivors clipped the story for their scrapbooks, daring to imagine playgrounds free from quarantine placards. Medical peers demanded broader data, prompting the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis to fund the massive double-blind field trials that followed. The March 26th announcement thus served as both a scientific milestone and a rallying cry for the millions of polio pioneers soon to roll up their sleeves. On March 26, 1971, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's declaration summoned East Pakistanis to form an independent Bangladesh after talks with West Pakistan collapsed. Operation Searchlight's brutal crackdown the previous night had galvanized students and workers, who now rallied under the green and red flag despite curfews. From hidden transmitters, Swadhin Bangla Betar Kendra broadcast appeals for resistance, carrying Mujib's words across rivers and refugee camps. Neighboring India braced for a refugee tide that would swell into the millions, even as diplomats debated how openly to support the rebels. Local militias, soon to be organized into the Mukti Bahini, scavenged arms and plotted sabotage to keep the independence bid alive. March 26th became both Independence Day and a diplomatic dilemma, forcing global institutions to confront genocide reports and the prospect of war. On March 26, 1979, President Anwar Sadat and Prime Minister Menachem Begin signed the Egypt-Israel peace treaty on the White House lawn. The document capped 18 months of Carter's relentless shuttle diplomacy following the Camp David Accords, translating frameworks into binding clauses. Mutual recognition, phased Sinai withdrawal, and U.S. monitoring mechanisms were spelled out line by line before a global press corps. Egyptians debated trading territory for peace, while Israelis weighed security guarantees against the political cost of dismantling settlements. Implementation required choreographed convoys across the Sinai, with American engineers and UN observers verifying each stage of withdrawal. The treaty isolated Egypt within the Arab League, yet it also opened the door to decades of cold but enduring Egyptian-Israeli cooperation. On March 26, 1995, the Schengen Agreement took effect for 7 European nations, erasing routine passport controls at their shared frontiers. At midnight ceremonies, customs officers hoisted barriers and locals drove through simply to savor the new freedom of movement. Commuters bound for work across the Luxembourg-France line kept passports in their pockets, shaving minutes off daily routines. Behind the celebration, technicians synced the Schengen information system, ensuring police cooperation matched the newfound openness. From an Angevin king's fatal wound to a continent without border booths, March 26th shows how power, knowledge, art, faith, war, medicine, and diplomacy share one long timeline. Until tomorrow, this was This Day in History,